Hello and welcome back to A Shark's Perspective. Like any other medium, podcasting is evolving. Figuring out what's next, though, and how to reach the next wave of listeners is the goal. Are we at peak today? Is this as good as it gets? Really, what does the research tell us? Tom Webster is a market researcher, podcaster, speaker, and the vice president of strategy and marketing at Edison Research, a market research firm who is also the leading podcast research company in the world. And on this episode, we'll discuss podcasting and audio. What's the next frontier? And also how to reach that next audience. The infinite dial, keynoting and freenoting, Spotify, whether or not we're at peak, rookie listeners, podcast movement, Jimmy Buffett, Pat Flynn, and a lot more. So let's tune in to a senior market researcher with a very research marketing shark on this episode of A Shark's Perspective. All right, Tom, thank you so much for joining us today on A Shark's Perspective. If you would, tell people a little bit about your background and your career today, please.
Yeah, so I'm a market researcher by trade. I've been one for nearly 25 years, 15 of those at Edison Research. And most of my day job at Edison is about consumer insights and solving business problems. And lately, I have stumbled into quite a career in audio. We do a lot of audio research at Edison too. So I'm basically head up the digital audio practice at Edison, which includes podcasting and streaming and even audiobooks.
What do you consider yourself more of, as a marketer or as a researcher?
I consider myself a researcher. I think, I guess I do a lot of what passes for marketing from Edison, but I think mostly, we're a very inbound, thought leadership driven company. I like to think that we do quality work, and that tends to market us for us, I think. So I think I'm more of an accidental marketer than anything else.
Sure.
But I've learned a few things along the way.
Well, an accidental podcaster as well. You've had a pretty successful podcast over the careers with a marketing companion, and now with a freenoter, which I think is fantastic. If you would tell a little bit about what the impetus was for that, because that exists for so many people who are speaking all the time, who just want to get their word out there without necessarily thinking they're going to make 10, 20 grand on a keynote speech.
Yeah, I mean, my primary impetus behind doing the freenoter was, A, a creative outlet, and B, just a chance to spend some more time with my wife, Tamsin, who you've had on the show.
Yeah.
So it's certainly not a chore doing the show, but we got the idea just kind of thinking about, I do a lot of freenoting. And just to explain to your listeners, a freenote is someone who speaks for free, which if you go to any big conference, they may have 2 or 3 celebrity paid keynoters, but then the days are filled with breakout session after breakout session of people slaving away, trotting the boards, giving breakout sessions and talks for no money, in the hopes of driving some business for their company without looking like they're selling from the stage. And we realized that there weren't really a lot of resources for people like that. There are plenty of resources on just how to be a better speaker, yes, and there are also resources for professional speakers on getting gigs and things. But the peculiar craft of representing your company from the stage, there weren't a lot of resources on. So that's what the freenoter is all about.
Well, so you're also spending a lot of time, we're not going to go political with all the stuff going on today, especially today when we're recording this, but you're also spending a lot of time on political research. What is that sort of looking like for 2020?
So we are the sole providers of exit polling data and also vote count data for the major news networks. So on starting with the Iowa caucus and all the way through the general election next year, whenever you see exit polling data on, regardless of the network that you're watching, that exit poll data comes from us, and it's a gargantuan effort. I know. I posted a picture on my Twitter feed a couple days ago of a crate of mechanical pencils that we are shipping out to all of the people doing exit polling for us, and you've never seen so many pencils in your life. There had to have been 1 million pencils in that box. So it's a huge logistical effort. We've been the sole providers of exit polling in this country since 2003. So it's a sacred charge. It's a job that we take very, very seriously, and When we have a good night, you do not hear our name.
Yeah. Well, are you seeing that it's becoming a lot easier or a lot more difficult today to gather all of that? I mean, I love to believe that it's so much easier always to gather that data, but there's so
Yeah.
much bias on how to read the data correctly as well.
Well, everything has bias, Shark. I
Yeah.
mean, any survey. I mean, essentially, an exit poll is a survey like any other. It's a
Exactly.
survey. We're fortunate with exit polling, though, that the response rates are very, very high. When we ask people if they would take an exit poll, our response rates are in the 40s.
Mm-hmm.
And compare that to the last time you sent a survey out to your email database. Do that math. If you got to 1%,
Exactly.
you'd be laughing.
Yeah.
So our response rates are great. There's always different forms of bias, and we track and model dozens and dozens of variables when we're doing the exit poll. We track the race, age, and sex of the interviewers
Mm-hmm.
that are conducting the exit polls to see if there's a hidden bias there. We have data on certain groups being more reluctant than others to take an exit poll, and so all of that gets modeled. But ultimately, we've never missed a projection. Some things maybe we couldn't project, but we've never gone out with something wrong, and I think that's probably why we keep getting hired.
So a lot of your research over the last year plus has been around podcasting. I've read quite a few of your different posts. Out of curiosity, do you think more of the interest has emerged in podcasting over the last fairly recent time frame? Is it because of the money pouring into podcasting? I know SNL made a joke about podcasting, so we're starting to see a little more people understanding what podcasting is and so on and so forth. But why do you think there's more of an interest in podcasting today? Because it's what? I mean, where are we talking? 15, 20 years now that almost 15 years now that podcasting's really been strong.
Yeah, 15. And we've actually been tracking it at Edison for 14 of those 15 years. So we have been collecting and presenting that data for a very long time. We've served this space.
Sure.
But really, the last 3 have been markedly different to the previous 12. And not so much in adoption and consumption, because that's always been a slow build. I mean, every year that we've reported it, we started reporting it in 2006. Every year that we've reported it, it's gone up a little bit. It's never shot up like YouTube or online video did. It's never shot up, with sort of an extreme growth curve. It adds a little bit every year, and it continues to do that. Although the last year we did see the largest percentage point growth that we've seen. But I think you sort of hit it on the head, Shark, with the money thing. There's been more interest in the space, and some of that interest, I think, was triggered by Serial. I think when Serial became a phenomenon, a lot of media outlets and advertising and marketing publications started to cover it. It's not that it brought millions and millions of new listeners into the space, but it brought some recognition amongst the digerati, the chattering classes, to take a look at it as a potential advertising platform. And we've done a lot of brand lift research for a lot of the podcast networks at Edison, where we look at how well brand advertising and things like that do on podcasts, and the results are extraordinarily positive. So it's not surprising that there's a lot more money being poured into the space. And when you pour that money into the space, with it comes an obligation to make that money back. And with that obligation to make that money back, you're seeing a lot more mass appeal, mainstream content being produced. And that's really expanding the reach of podcasting. The other thing that has been an even more recent phenomenon, and it's big enough that they can be singled out here, is Spotify. Spotify really made a major push into podcasting for real this time last summer, and it's had a definite impact. They're now clearly the number 2 podcast client in terms of playing, and in certain age groups they're teetering on number 1. They certainly have attracted a lot more younger people to the space. So those have been really the biggest changes.
Well, I was just going to say, I think I have seen such a remarkably higher number of people that reach out to me now wanting to pour money into the advertising of the show, which I've stayed away from for a lot of different reasons to date. Now, by the time this airs, I may change my mind, but the number
Brought
of
to you
people,
by
yeah, exactly. But it's amazing how many offers I'm getting today, and I'm at nearly at show 200 now. So it's not
yeah.
like I've just started this, but there is. I started seeing a little bit of it at about 100. The noise started a lot at 150, and now it's getting offers every day, and what scares me is just the fact that we've done as much as we could as marketers and advertisers to destroy pretty much every channel with too much advertising, and it just seems like podcasting is the next bastion of despair, if you will, with wherever we can pour as many ads in as possible. So it's really frustrating because it just depends on the medium as well. But I'm curious what your take is on podcasting when we get a little bit deeper into the data. But I'm also seeing a little bit of a tick up, I think, that's creating better types of content. And I'll give you a couple of examples. GE came out with the Messenger, and SAP came out with Searching for Salai, and they were fictional stories that were not purely trying to sell a product or service. They had some advertising on the back end, but Searching for Salai won the 2019 Content Award, I believe, Podcast Content Award at Content Marketing World. And it was a podcast that was fiction-based. It talked about Leonardo da Vinci, and it just so happened that SAP was introducing a new product called Leonardo. So, they were doing some advertising on the back end, but they were doing more of a fiction or a non-sales version of a sales brochure for a product and service. And that was nice to see. But you're also seeing, I think, a lot of that where podcasters are learning to be, or say podcasters or brands are learning to be more clever with how they present that kind of content.
Yeah, I mean, what's happening really is that the space it's growing up, and as it grows up, it's beginning to develop multiple streams of revenue, and it's not one or the other. It's all of them, and that's what's going to keep the space healthy and vibrant. I mean, the space really began in advertising as a direct response channel.
Exactly.
Performance marketing, and in the past 3 years, we've seen a lot more brand advertising, but branded podcasts like the ones that you're speaking about. There's some really compelling ones out there. I know my friend Steve Pratt has a company, Pacific Content, out in Vancouver, and they just won an award for the branded podcast they produced for Facebook, 3.5 Degrees.
Yeah.
There's a great So there's wonderful branded content out there, and I think the key to it is to build a great show first.
Agreed.
Because a show about product is a pretty lousy show.
Agreed. And I've done direct response for a long time, so I know. I'm so glad that you brought that up, that it was originally done that way, but I'm glad it's not done or shouldn't be done that way on the front end. I'm glad that at least people are starting to focus on creating great shows first. And anyway, let's dive into your data. Kind of unpack, if you will, a little bit about how you look at rookies and veterans who are listening to the podcasts themselves.
Yeah, this was I gave a keynote at Podcast Movement in 2018, and I challenged the attendees to really think about the concept of the show, because what got podcasting here is not going to get us to the next 50 million or 100 million listeners, because they're different people. Originally, if you started listening to podcasts when I did, or perhaps when you did, there was some interest in the technology. There was definitely some interest in the content, because you're able to find content that you couldn't find anywhere else. And it was also just kind of a cool thing to do. But, the next 50 million listeners, that they don't really care about that, right? That's not necessarily why they're coming to podcasting. They're watching the top 10 Nielsen rated shows on TV, and they're not necessarily finding that content in podcasting. So my point was that to get the next batch of listeners, we have to think like that next batch of listeners. And so this year, we went back to Podcast Movement. Edison gave the research keynote again. And we did a project where we looked at rookies and veterans, with rookies being people who had discovered podcasting just in the last 6 months, and veterans for at least 3 years or more. And functionally, most of them were greater than 5 years. And I think if I could sum up the differences really, really simply, it's this. I think veterans seek out content. They're looking for that next podcast. They're getting recommendations. They're using podcast clients to find other podcasts. Rookies are more likely to encounter content than to seek it. and they're encountering it in the wild. They're encountering it on Facebook, on Instagram, they're on Spotify, and a lot on YouTube. And so their perception of what a podcast is and can be is somewhat different. And there's no bigger example of that than the Joe Rogan show.
Yeah,
Joe Rogan,
exactly.
Our data shows that that's the most listened to podcast in America in terms of reach. And that's may or may not be true if you just look at his downloads, but you have to factor in all the YouTube views, which probably equal his downloads,
right.
And all of these other platforms. And I suppose there are some technocrats that can be persnickety about the definition of a podcast, but I'm just encouraged that we're getting all of these new listeners. So
Yeah.
I'm not in the business of talking somebody out of whether or not they're listening to a podcast if they watch it on YouTube.
Yeah, and Joe's not. I mean, he's not a junior person either. I mean, he's in his late 40s, I believe, or early 50s.
Early 50s, I think.
Early 50s, yeah. And I mean, but you put Elon Musk, smoking marijuana, and then it ends up on the world news. It drives young and old to start listening to more podcast listens. And I like his show. I still haven't figured out why it's number one, but if you get that kind of PR and the kind of guests he gets behind it, I guess I understand why. But you also uncovered, I thought it was really interesting information you uncovered, was the female versus male breakout. And I mean, just if you look at the emotion that goes behind so many of the female podcasts, I really think they have a leg up on us, because some of the female podcasts are extremely powerful, as well as many of them are informative. But talk a little bit about the change you're starting to see with females versus males in podcasting.
Well, when podcasting first started, it was, the average podcast was two white dudes talking about
Exactly.
internet routers, right? Yeah. And with all of the money and attention brought into the space, there's the onus is on the podcast industry to be diverse, to have content for everybody, really.
Mm-hmm.
And as we are starting to see more new listeners come in, the rookies are actually more likely to be female. And I wouldn't necessarily point to the sex of podcast hosts here. I would point to genres and types of content, and there are differences here. One of the biggest genres in podcasting is true crime. True crime is the catnip of podcasting right now, and that's a genre that happens to have huge female appeal. So as more and more research is done on listeners, and there's a bigger concerted effort by podcast networks to reflect the fabric of America, both in terms of gender and also ethnicity, then it's going to normalize, and it is starting to approach the U.S. population in terms of age and sex.
Well, our friend Rand Fishkin, I've heard him make this joke a couple of times about how if you're a white male in your 40s, then you by law you have to have your own podcast. But I think it's really interesting just to see the fact that women have a she-cast movement that a friend of mine went to, and some of the podcasts that they're doing are really impressive. But talk a little bit about the listening to the entire podcast. This is one that I think really just surprises me more and more and more, because I tend to set it and forget it and listen to a whole show. I guess some of that depends on traffic, but I really thought that was fascinating, your research on that, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, rookies indicated that they were less likely to listen to the entire show. And I think that's a stat that can easily be misinterpreted. When I first revealed that stat to some veteran podcasters, they interpreted it as rookies having a shorter attention span,
of
right?
Course.
Being flighty. And I don't think that's correct. The early listeners to podcasters, they were really into podcasts. There are a lot of tech podcasts. People really were into the content. But the people that we're attracting now, right, their choice is, I could watch Netflix tonight, or I could listen to a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why they are not necessarily as likely to listen to an entire podcast is because their standards are high, not because their attention span is low. And there aren't a lot of great podcasts out there. There's a lot of crappy podcasts out there. And when we're talking about this new rookie incoming crop of podcast listeners, they expect really high quality, broad concept, well-produced content, because that's what they're used to consuming. And when a podcast doesn't deliver that, it's more of a turnoff than it is to the earlier generation of podcast listeners. So I don't look upon this in any way as something that denigrates the rookies. I really look at it more as the kind of the state of content.
So when you're this kind of a personal question for you now as a podcaster with Tamsin, with the information you have, how does it inform you to make a better podcast on your own?
Well, I really try to put on a show. It's something that I talk about all the time. I mean, if you've listened to the Freenoter, we attempt to create an entertainment, right? There's music, there's production values, there's humor. I mean, that's certainly one of the hallmarks of the show that I used to do with Mark Schaefer, the marketing companion, was that we wanted to put on a show, and we would often script a funny bit at the
just
beginning.
The intro alone.
Oh, Scott Mottie's intros are pure gold. So, because I think, and I think this is something to think about if you are a company, work for a company, you're listening to this and you're thinking about a podcast. Let's say you make tires. Okay, your competition is not other podcasts about tires.
Exactly.
Your competition is This American Life. Your competition, your competition is Joe Rogan, and that may seem unfair, but I think you have at least have the responsibility to try to put on a show.
Well, you can inject a lot of thought leadership. It just doesn't have to be, two boring experts at your company, reciting brand babble. People don't want to hear that. They want to be infotained. So.
Yeah, and whenever I talk to companies about doing a podcast, I try to talk them out of it. Like, I push really, really hard on it, because it's a different dog than the other kind of marketing channels that you put out there.
Agreed.
I mean, the one great thing about the podcast audience, they are an incredibly engaged, devoted audience, and a podcast, I think, aggregates that most engaged 10% of your existing base, and provides a deeper level of contact and connection with them. It's a wonderful tool for that. It's not a great tool to build reach, I don't think. To build a completely new audience, that certainly takes a long time in podcasting.
Well, it does help as well when you have the voice you do. I know my biggest fear when I do a podcast is whether or not I'm battling a sinus infection. And I've done radio. I've done radio throughout my years, but to have the deep tone to a voice like you have, I mean, you have a voice made for podcasting. So if anything, I think that obviously really helps the listening value of it. So one of the other bits that you talked about as well with how Spotify, got into the mix more, and iHeartRadio is getting more into it. Everybody seems to be getting more into it. Talk a little bit about the ways that people are listening to podcasts, because I think so many people just think it's, Apple Podcasts, which really didn't even rebrand itself as Apple Podcasts until, was it the end of 2018 or first of 2019? I can't even remember, but
2018. Yeah.
So that was just a shift that's not that long ago.
I still hear podcasts, current podcasts, some big ones, talk about subscribing to us on iTunes, which no longer exists. So yeah, I think the 10 years ago, I think the cri de coeur of the podcast producer was to get everybody to subscribe to them on iTunes. And there are now, I think there's 3 problems with that sentence now. Number 1, there's no iTunes. Number 2, every time I see someone's podcast stats and they are heavily Apple centric, it's a cry for help. There's a lot more Android phones out there.
Yeah.
And also that goal, I think, of get them to subscribe. It's a nice goal. I think it worked in the early days of podcasting, but I think you sort of have to, and I made the point in the keynote that I gave at Podcast Movement about this, you have to be able to, if not monetize, then love them where they are, where they found you. Because people are finding podcasts in all kinds of places. They're finding them on SoundCloud. They're finding them on YouTube. They're finding them on Instagram. And you're not necessarily going to be able to corral them onto one neat little platform. So you have to figure it out. You have to figure out from a metric standpoint how to count all of that. And you also have to make it worth being on all of those platforms and have and find the value in that for you without making the audience change their behavior, because they're in control. You never have been.
Well, there's something you just said that sparked my memory from reading that article, your manifesto in 2018, but also made me think about there's no, it's kind of like social media in general. There's no one formula either that anybody can or should necessarily replicate. There's just too much noise about you personally or your brand or whatever company you're working for as to whether or not that's going to work. So I mean, I know a lot of the being the fundamentals of being where the people are is one thing, and then creating the kind of content that people want to listen to is so different. And maybe they want to listen to something different on a website than they do on Apple Podcasts or an Android as well. I mean, there are different ways that we consume TV and video, and that's something I think about a lot today, of just how that's being, I don't know, mechanized once we create the content. So,
well, and I think podcasters are getting better and better. I mean, I think every new podcaster that enters the space comes in with some of the knowledge from the old, but also a desire to get better. And I think, people that have been in podcasting for a very long time have this kind of received wisdom about what a podcast is supposed to do and sound like. And I don't know that I buy that, because again, the audience is changing. And if we're going to reach new people and I think really explore the true power of what this medium is, which I believe is a universal behavior.
mm-hmm.
It's got a goofy word, but it's really just, I want to listen to what I want to, where and when I want. And that's the behavior that is enabled. And that's a universal behavior. But I think we have to kind of forget some of that received wisdom of the early 2000s and look at who's killing it right now. So that's a big part of it.
Well, Pat Flynn, and I'm probably going to state this incorrectly, but Pat Flynn brought up some point, I believe, at Podcast Movement in 2018. I think I remember reading about it. Might have been 2019, but it was about how he thought the space was too crowded. If you hadn't made it by now, you weren't necessarily going to make it. Does that ring a bell with you at all? And does it make sense to you?
I like Pat. I'm going to disagree with him pretty strongly here. I've heard this a lot in the space, that it's, we're at peak podcasts. There are too many podcasts. There aren't too many podcasts. No. There are a lot of bad podcasts. I know Daniel Lewis at the Audacity to Podcast tracks a lot of things from Apple's API and things like that. And he just posted this week that Apple now has 800,000 podcasts. Right, that's the extent of the podcast universe, is 800,000 podcasts for all time. Right, last year alone, there were over 1 million self-published books. I think if I've said this before, if we are at peak podcasting now, then we hit peak book back in 1855. I don't think we're at peak anything. I think what you're seeing are people that have been in podcasting back when there was not a lot of noise in the space and did well, now having to scrap for it, and now having to really fight for the earballs that used to be a little bit easier to collect, because there's a lot of really good content out there right now. And you've got a lot of, these newcomers to the space that, if you've been podcasting for a while, maybe you see it as noise or whatever, but they're making really compelling content.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm a marketer. I'm not a podcaster, but I've done several podcasts over the years, having done radio. I mean, I sort of think this goes all the way back to Christian Slater and Pump Up the Volume. I mean, what it was like pirate radio back in the 90s. I mean, to me, that's kind of how some of the impetus for this started. This whole movement started. People just wanted to put out what they wanted to say in a place where they could consume it and not get arrested for it like he was doing. But I don't know that how much of this really matters unless somebody's really fighting for ad dollars half the time. And I'm really curious, how do the people at Podcast Movement, and again, I do a podcast like you do, but I don't know that I don't consider myself necessarily a podcaster. Do people
200 shows in the tank,
Well,
Shark. I think you are.
I know, but I'm enjoying talking about marketing and advertising and trying to help people solve problems because I've got a few gray hairs. I've failed many times, so I try to put out helpful information from people like you. From the guests I've been very lucky to have on, like Tamsin, Ann Handley, Guy Kawasaki, Martin Lindstrom, all these amazing people that know their stuff, like you. If it helps us solve problems, then that's what I feel like I'm spending time doing. But I'm curious, do people in the podcast movement see your research as something that's helping them? Are they defensive about it? What's the movement, if you will, opinion on the research you're bringing today?
I think it's been overwhelmingly positive. I mean, the one thing, and we've been honored to be asked to give the research keynote for 3 years in a row. The reaction from the space has really been universally positive, and I think no small part of that is that we have been serving the space for 14 years.
Right.
And so back when people were really struggling and trying to make money and trying to put together media kits, they had our research. They had our research to put in, and it's the most credible research in the space, frankly. So I think there's always been that kind of respect, and people might be surprised by numbers. They might quibble with them. I think some of that is maybe just a lack of familiarity with the kinds of numbers that we produce and things like that. I'll give you a funny example. I spoke at a conference in Amsterdam a couple of years ago, and I showed a statistic about where people listen to podcasts the most, and the number one location year after year is home by a lot.
Yeah.
And this should make intuitive sense because number one, most people can't listen to a podcast at work, unless they work in a toll booth or something. I mean, it's a very lean forward activity to listen to a podcast, and the technology to listen to podcasts without friction in vehicles turns over pretty slowly. We buy a new car every 10 years, so that takes some time. So I presented this chart in Amsterdam, and a functioning professional human stood up and disputed it, saying that everybody listens to podcasts on bikes and not at home. Everybody listens to them on their commute. And I looked at her and I said, "But you're in Amsterdam."
Yeah.
And it's hard for people to kind of see the label of the jar they're in.
Very, very true. But she was Dutch, so that explains it. So, by the way, that was a completely loaded question because I knew you had provided that research. So I was assuming that they hadn't invited you back, not once, but twice, if they didn't love you. But put your prognosticator hat on. Where, if you were to pull out your magic 8-ball to get the prognostication on where podcasting will go based on the research you've done, what do you predict for the near-term future of podcasting?
You've invited a market researcher on, Shark, so now get ready to get unloaded upon. I don't predict anything.
Good for
I
you.
think it is my job to be a reliable discerner of the present, and that's what I focus on. I think anytime I get caught up in predicting, then I have a dog in the fight, and if I have a dog in the fight, then it changes the way you look at numbers. I just don't do it.
No, that's fantastic. So I could not agree more. I'm also of the opinion that most predictions for any year ahead, which I just did on another radio podcast show this morning, will be completely wrong, and just hopefully nobody will listen to it in February. So, but I totally have respect for that. So, Tom, you're in the Boston area. Your Bruins occasionally play the Sharks. But we're talking about different sharks on a shark's perspective. I've asked this question of your wife before on a previous episode. What is your favorite kind of shark and why?
What is my favorite kind of shark and why?
I wondered if Tamsin had warned you or not.
No, I am completely unprepared. Completely unprepared for this question.
Okay,
but I'm going to say it's a land shark lager.
Good man. One of the few people I can get that understands why I drink that beer. When Coronas aren't available, land shark's the way to go. It's making Jimmy Buffett $1 every time we say it too. So
absolutely, and I'm sure he needs the dollars.
Exactly. Well, Tom, it's that special time of the show. Are you ready for the 5 most interesting and important questions you're going to be asked today?
Bring it on.
All right. Number 1, Apple or Spotify?
I'm going They're both clients, so I'm going to say yes and.
Okay, good, fair enough. Number 2, New England clam chowder and some fresh lobster, followed by fresh lobster from Legal Seafood, or a Fenway Frank and a Sam Adams at a Red Sox game.
Oh, the lobster, 100%.
Really?
I grew up in Maine. Like,
oh, there you go.
Yeah, forget it. Forget it.
Makes sense.
I don't even know what's in a hot dog.
I'm sure it's leftover parts of lobster we don't want to know.
It ain't lobster, I'll tell you that.
Number 3, fictional podcasts like true crime or nonfiction educational podcasts like what we're doing now.
I lean towards the latter, but I also listen to a lot of audiobooks. So there's a lot of fiction in my life, and the lines between the two blur.
Agreed. Number 4 is a research question for you. Email survey or phone questionnaire?
Phone questionnaire.
And why so?
Yeah, still a higher response rate, still more representative. For the Infinite Dial, which is our flagship media behavior study, we every year we increase the percentage of mobile phone interviews, which are about 4 times as expensive as landline interviews. But you have to do it. It's over half mobile phone now. It is still the gold standard for survey research, and no one should tell you differently.
Number 5, and the most important question that you're going to be asked today is biscuits or cornbread?
I spent 10 years of my life in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and I know everybody has their sort of restaurant or recipe of choice, but the Sunrise Biscuit Kitchen in Chapel Hill, North Carolina,
good man,
makes about the best damn biscuit you'll ever have. So biscuit, 100%.
Good man. So Tom, where can people find out more about you, follow your thought leadership, the research you're doing at Edison, hear you speak, and more?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter at Webby2001, WEBBY 2001. I think I'm on Medium that way too, which is where I post some of my infrequent longer pieces. And our research is all available at edisonresearch.com.
Tom, thank you so much for being with me today on A Shark's Perspective.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So there was my conversation with Tom Webster, a market researcher, podcaster, speaker, and the Vice President of Strategy and Marketing at Edison Research, a market research firm who is also the leading podcast research company in the world. Let's take a look at 3 key takeaways from my conversation with him. First, podcasting has been around for years, but we're talking about it a lot more today. We still have to explain to a lot of people, though, what a podcast even is. But he brought up Spotify, which is such a great example of how it's changing how we consume media differently today. The reason that it's becoming more prevalent in retail conversations on a more mass appeal and interest with comedy skits on Saturday Night Live or Spotify or anywhere else is because of the influx of money in advertising. And as I said, I get requests to advertise quite frequently, especially because of the guests that have appeared on the show, like Tom and other notables that I've mentioned previously. You can look at the list. They're all awesome. But you're already seeing it, and it's a thought of my own. We've got to make certain that advertising doesn't destroy podcasting like it has in a lot of other channels. Second, Tom's data reflects how rookies are not often listening to the entire show. His point is that it's not because their attention span's too short. It's because they have options. That's the primary reason people switch around. Great example he gave. If you work in the tire industry, you have a podcast. You're not competing against other tire companies, but instead against Joe Rogan. So be as infotaining as you can. Third, Tom does it on his show. I do it on mine. We try to make it a show and provide better content. There are so many bad shows out there that don't last past episode 7 and focus little to none on the production value, and it shows, and it clutters up the field. Focus on better content. We don't need, as listeners, for podcasts to go the way of the blog. Got a question? Send me an email to Kenneth@asharksperspective.com. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. So let's do some research, figure out what's next, and then let's do it together on the next episode of A Shark's Perspective.